I'd like to introduce Linda Canada. She's been a member of the Japanese American Historical Society for over 26 years. Our society has been, in being for about 32 years. So Linda is one of the long timers, and she served in a number of really important roles. She was its president at one point, archivist, a board member, but also she has participated in a speakers bureau in which she is one of the main speakers, and she gets community people to go out to community presentations and speak on about their family's history and our history. She also speaks for many other organizations, including the San Diego History Center, organizations like Rhodes Scholar, Oasis, and many of our senior living facilities. She holds a BA in history from the UCLA and a JD from Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And before becoming so active with JAHSSD, she did practice law in San Diego. But we're so grateful that that did not suit her, and she turned to history. And we have been the beneficiary since. So thank you, Linda. And also we have Russell Endo. Russell is a retired professor of sociology and Asian American studies at the University of Colorado. So he is zooming in today from outside of Boulder, Colorado. He began his academic career in 1970, and he helped create Asian American studies programs at the University of Washington and the University of Colorado. He is the primary researcher for the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition, and is also working with several other groups that include the Amachi Historical Society and Duncan Williams' Ide Name Project. I think many of us are now becoming aware of the Ide Project at JANM and have visited. Thank you also for Russell's participation with that important project. Now, currently, he's investigating the wartime arrest and imprisonment of enemy aliens, especially the Issei in Southern California. He grew up in Los Angeles, and during the war, members of his family were incarcerated at Tuna Canyon, Santa Anita, Jerome, Roar, and Manzanar. And I just have noted his grandfather, Heigoro Endo, was incarcerated at the Tuna Canyon Detention Station, as were many San Diego Issei. So I'm now so happy to turn the program over to Linda and then Russell. They collaborated. They created this program. So I do want to give you lots of credit for coming together as researchers, as historians, to bring us this important information. So thank you very much. And I toss it now to Linda.
Thank you very much, Kay. I appreciate that introduction. We've kind of divided up the topic of World War II experiences of the San Diego Nikkei into about 3 different sections. I will be giving the first and the third, and then Russell has recorded something that will play in the middle, and then at the end, we will be both available for any questions that you can put in the chat, and we will deal with afterwards. I wanted to give sort of a short background of the community here in San Diego as a setting for the World War II experiences that they had. And so let's just start with the fact that Japanese people, Japanese men, started to leave Japan to go into the pineapple and the sugarcane fields in Hawaii. Later, they came over to the mainland and worked in the railroads. And eventually, some of them ended up back in San Diego, not back in, but in San Diego, where the very earliest of them worked in the what they called the salt farms down at the foot of San Diego Bay, and also some working preparing charcoal for use over the construction project for the Hotel del Coronado. But here in San Diego, and then down further south in Mexico, we had a Japanese businessman named Masaharu Konda, who got a fishing concession from the Mexican government and started with a group of men down in Mexico who were capturing abalone, turtle, and some lobsters, cutting them up, drying them in the sun. Periodically, boats would go down to pick up these materials. Kondo would ship them back up to San Diego, where they would be bid upon by either Chinese or Japanese middlemen who would then ship them off to China or Japan. Kondo was doing pretty well with this business, so he was eventually able to hire 71 tuna fishermen from Japan to fish tuna along the coast of Mexico. Now, they knew the tuna was there because they had seen them swimming as they were at shore on what is a very bleak kind of housing that they had here along the coast of Mexico. This is about 300 miles south of San Diego at a place that became known as Turtle Bay because of the turtles that made their life there. But gradually the fishing community got bigger. In 1915, of the fishermen in California, only about 13% were Japanese. But by 5 years later, that percentage had doubled. Japanese were now 28% of the total. And part of the reason for that was the US involvement in World War I and the necessary to obtain food that could be dried or otherwise processed and sent over to the men who were fighting over in the European front. So we had more fishermen catching more fish. And by 1923, the Japanese represented about half the crews of the fishing boats in San Diego. Now, when they came here, they introduced some new things, new techniques that were quickly taken on by other local fishermen, such things as bamboo fishing poles, barbless hooks, and chumming or throwing bait in the water in order to excite the tuna that were down there so that they could be easily copied. Kondo was doing so well in his business that by 1924, he was able to have built two 800-ton refrigerated ships that he sent here to gather the fish, and now they could send the fish over to be processed in Japan. So that was a whole change in the industry. And things were going pretty well for him until 1931, when there was a Mexican Revolution and there was a fire that destroyed the cannery that he had down in Mexico, and that changed everything. He actually declared bankruptcy, he returned to Japan, and he never came back to the United States. But there were already some Japanese businessmen here who stepped in and took over and actually formed a new corporation. And their names were Abe, Izumi, and Miura. And they continued this business, but they were having to deal with, in the 1930s, some of the racially motivated restrictions that had been placed on Japanese fishing. So earlier, Japanese had been made ineligible for citizenship simply because they were not white. Later law made them not eligible for commercial fishing licenses. Abe was the one that led the challenge against this later law, and the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, which basically made the new law it could not be enforced. And so the whole issue of whether or not Japanese could get commercial fishing license died out around 1939. But it's important to know that that was kind of the background of what was going on. There were these racially motivated steps that were being taken as the number of Japanese fishermen increased in the community, but also as their success in the field increased. The boat that you see on the left is part of the Westgate Cannery, 1940s, new industry here. And what you're seeing are Japanese fishermen using their bamboo poles in order to fish for one of the larger tuna that the spotter has seen. And so these poles all come together into a single hook. The hook has no barbs on the back. So when the fishermen together coordinate to pull in a large tuna, the tuna simply slips off the back of the hook and falls to the deck of the boat, which is what you can see in the right-hand picture. You can see a lot of tuna that are sitting there that have been caught. The fishermen who you may not be able to see because of where the photos are of those speakers is Mas Tsuida, who was the son of a fishing captain and what himself became a fishing captain. So he was a Issei who lived in San Diego and served in the 442nd during World War II. Well, the canneries were helpful with making sure that Japanese fishermen could get housing because, again, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. And so there were different housing projects available. The one above, the lighter colored one, is housing that was nicknamed Hokkaido, after the northernmost island, major island in the Japanese chain. So Hokkaido was up near close to the San Diego airport where that eventually went in. The lower one was much larger, and it was put together by the Van Camp cannery. And so many of the Japanese fishermen and their wives and their children lived at this other fish camp. The presence of the wives is important because when the fish-laden boats came in, the wives then went on duty and went over to help in the canning process. Japanese men became involved in agriculture as well. Those were some of the first jobs that were available to them as they were coming back from working on the railroads. And they were simply laborers. And as they got more skilled with local farming techniques, then the farmers wanted to hire them. And so some of the larger farms made available barracks like these, or this one was called the Shimokawa camp. It was located down in the community of Bonita, south of the city of San Diego. And the workers, all bachelors, lived in these barracks, and this was their home. They were quickly available to the businessman farmer if he needed help with the fields. Here's another early San Diego family, Nakagawa, shown in their field. They're actually crating celery for the market. Celery was a tremendously successful business or crop for farmers in the South Bay area of San Diego. And celery, the celery capital of the world, was a name put forward for the city of Chula Vista at that time. Now, there was good news and bad news. If you're being very successful, you're maybe making money. The bad news is that other people in the community may become very jealous of your success. So there's a little undercurrent of displeasure with the success of Japanese farmers. We have another Japanese-American family here in San Diego. Back in the 1920s and 30s, they were growing chili peppers and drying them, and they were growing them up in the northern part of our county, up near the community of Oceanside and east of there. So these had to be trucked down to San Diego, where they were then put on ships and shipped out of San Diego. Yaskochis went away to camp, came back, and were able to participate in today's agricultural business. And today, if you live in San Diego, you know Yaskochi strawberries are something you really want to be able to get hold of in the springtime. With all of these farmers and fishermen living along the coastline and in especially the southern part of San Diego, there were a number of businesses that sprung up at this time that catered to the Japanese farmers who would come in from long distances away from their farms in the weekends to bring in fresh crops and to stock up on things that they might need. Here are some more of the businesses. There was a barber shop, a confectionery, a laundry where they could have their laundry done. Something that sprung up was sort of a barter system where the fishermen would bring in a round of tuna, put it on a block of ice, and leave it in the grocery store, where men who were bringing in crops from the fields could then trade out for parts of the tuna. So this was informal Japanese trade going on. The Japanese businesses, for the most part, were near the intersection of 5th and Island Streets. That was really the heart of the Japanese commercial district here before the war. The building that you're seeing with the word Nippon Company on it is actually the home for the Nippon Shokai business, and it was the largest Japanese merchandising store in San Diego. But important was that the offices above were also made available. Dr. Takeda was in the office up at the second floor corner, and the smaller office up at the top were where trade, professional groups, or some of the prefectural organizations had meeting rooms, places where they could get together and socialize with the people who were from their community. Also, in the same time, some of the churches rose up. So we have a couple of Christian churches from the early 20s. This happens to be the Congregational Church. There's also one called the Holiness Church. And the Buddhist temple became very active and founded the place where it is still now located in 1926. So now we have social connections as well as religious, philosophical connections. We have places for their many children. You notice that The farmers and fishermen were very good at producing brand new Japanese Americans, American citizens to take on their businesses and to go to school and to go to the church groups here. There was also a drive to get the children to participate in the, quote, American organizations like the Boy Scouts, which had a branch at the Buddhist temple here. Another thing that the local people created so that their children did not lose sight of the fact that although they were American citizens, they were also of Japanese descent, was a series of language schools, gakuen, which were located various places around the county. Some were affiliated with the churches or the temples, and then others, like in Chula Vista and in the north part of the county, were freestanding gakuens, but they were making sure not only that the children were exposed to speaking Japanese, but that they were learning the etiquette, the way that you deal with older people, how respectful you need to be of the other people in your community. So, of course, Russell Endo will talk about what happened with these gakuen once the bombing of Pearl Harbor happened. But I do want you to know that there was a glimmer of hope in Chula Vista with all of the success of the celery growing that was going on down there. There was a celery growers union, and one of the white members of that union put together a huge picnic and encouraged and got the participation of the Japanese American farmers as well as the other members of the union. So here they have this affinity group. They share a common good, even though they have this basic difference in their background. So I think this was in 1939 or 36, a glimmer of hope for the future. Now, as a level of comfort and security was being achieved by these hardworking Japanese families, there were troubles brewing behind the scenes within agencies at the federal level and also among California's state and local governing agencies. My colleague Russell Endo has prepared a talk about the immediate pre-war years through the end of World War II.
Welcome to this presentation. My name is Russell Endo, and I am a retired professor of sociology and Asian American studies at the University of Colorado. Many of you are familiar with the mass incarceration of West Coast Japanese Americans under Executive Order 9066. I will be discussing something different that largely occurred beforehand. I want to begin by talking about government plans before World War II. During the 1930s, U.S. officials were concerned about the growing strength and aggressiveness of Japan, Germany, and Italy. Plans were developed to safeguard the internal security of the United States. One plan was to create lists of individuals in the U.S. who would be arrested in the event of a war. The best known was the Custodial Detention Index, created by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Lists were also compiled by the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Army's Military Intelligence Division. The Special Defense Unit was in charge of evaluating individuals. It used three main categories, A, B, and C, with A being the most dangerous. Suspicious Japanese, German, and Italian organizations in America were put into these three categories. Organization officials and members were then given individual A, B, or C classifications. For Japanese, such persons included religious, business, and other community leaders, and members of organizations with ties to Japan. However, the FBI continued to evaluate individuals on its own. Information on those who might be arrested was summarized on custodial detention cards. FBI arrest lists also included Japanese in occupations seen as dangerous, such as fishermen and Japanese language school teachers. In Southern California, FBI investigations of Japanese organizations resulted in numerous memoranda and reports. These were to be used as reference material in the arrest and incarceration of individuals. This slide shows an example of one major FBI intelligence report written in May 1941. After much discussion, various federal agencies reached an agreement on their roles at the outbreak of a war. Within the contiguous United States, the FBI would be responsible for making arrests. Individuals would then be detained in Department of Justice camps run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. There, they would be given a hearing. Those evaluated as threats to national security would be permanently interned in Army camps. In other parts of the U.S., such as Hawaii and Alaska, the military would be in charge of arrests, hearings, and imprisonment. In 1940, the government required all adult non-citizens to register and be fingerprinted. Just after the start of the war, in 1942, all non-citizens from enemy nations had to register. Let's turn now to World War II. When the war began, President Franklin Roosevelt issued presidential proclamations 2525, 2526, and 2527. This allowed the government to incarcerate non-citizens, or enemy aliens, from Japan, Germany, and Italy. It also authorized curfews, travel restrictions, and the exclusion of enemy aliens from designated areas, for example around ports, airports, rail yards, power plants, and military facilities. Possession of items such as firearms, cameras, and shortwave radios was forbidden. On December 7, 1941, the FBI began arresting Japanese, German, and Italian immigrants throughout the United States. After 11 days, over 1,400 Japanese, 1,200 Germans, and 200 Italians had been arrested. These early arrests sent shockwaves throughout Japanese communities. People felt threatened and that they were under constant surveillance. This had a chilling effect on community activities. FBI action in San Diego County was also swift. On December 7th, 25 Issei were arrested by the FBI or by other agencies on their behalf, such as local police departments. Many more Issei were picked up in subsequent days and weeks. High priority was given to Issei with Category A classifications, but others on FBI lists without classifications were also arrested. FBI arrests were often accompanied by disruptive searches of homes for contraband and for incriminating evidence, such as letters, photographs, and books. For Japanese families, this was a frightening and traumatic experience. Issei fishermen were of great concern to the U.S. government. They were accused of providing supplies to Imperial Japanese submarines and passing along information about coastal defenses and the disposition of U.S. Navy ships. Some government officials feared that Issei fishermen would help Japan during an attack on the West Coast or the Panama Canal. Consequently, Issei fishermen from San Diego and Los Angeles were under government surveillance before the war. Many were arrested in December 1941. Among the Issei fishermen arrested was Taju Koide. He was aboard the Magellan, a tuna boat operated by the Southern Commercial Company in San Diego. In the fall of 1941, the Magellan left San Diego for fishing grounds off the Mexican coast. On December 7th, it was headed to San Pedro to drop its catch off at the Franco-American cannery. An American warship intercepted the Magellan and escorted it to the cannery, where Koide and other Issei crew members were arrested. The arrests of Issei were covered by California newspapers. Many of these same papers would later become vocal advocates for the removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry. Politicians also weighed in on the removal of Issei. This is a resolution passed on January 27, 1942, by the San Diego City Council. Many other cities and counties in California passed similar resolutions. Among those arrested in San Diego County were the Issei leaders of Japanese community organizations, religious institutions, and economic associations. One example is Uichiro Kobayashi, owner of the Sun Cafe, and a prominent member of the Japanese Association and other community organizations. Arrests often included accusations of suspicious behavior. Kunitomo Maeda was a gardener, a former celery and tomato farmer, and a prominent Issei community leader from Coronado Island. He was falsely accused of various disloyal activities and of shining a spotlight on a Coronado City water supply tank during 2 blackouts after Pearl Harbor. Women as well as men were arrested. Jitsu Yokoto was the leader of a small Shinto sect in San Diego. The American government saw Shinto leaders as propagandists for Imperial Japan and as potential or actual spies. Sachiko Umezawa was employed by the Southern California Congregational Conference to conduct Sunday school classes in Chula Vista, Tijuana, and Ensenada. On Sunday, December 7, 1941, she was arrested while crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. From December 1941 to March 1942, over 275 Issei from San Diego County were arrested. Most of the major Issei leaders in the county were arrested. They left behind spouses and children who had to fend for themselves. Japanese families and communities in San Diego County were now vulnerable to further government actions. I want to talk now about what happened to the arrested Issei from San Diego County. After their arrest, Issei were held in the San Diego County Jail. Many were interrogated, fingerprinted, and had mugshots taken. Almost 70% were then transferred to the Tuna Canyon Detention Station, a Department of Justice camp. Tuna Canyon was located within the city of Los Angeles, in Tujunga, about 14 miles northwest of the Los Angeles City Hall. Tuna Canyon was one of 2 key confinement sites in the earliest forced removal of Japanese from Southern California. Before the war, plans were made to incarcerate enemy aliens from Southern California in San Pedro. A search was conducted for a second site. Several places in Los Angeles and Ventura counties were considered. Just before the war, an unused civilian conservation corps camp in Tujunga was selected. Hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, this camp was turned over to the Department of Justice. On December 16, 1941, Tuna Canyon received its first prisoners. Tuna Canyon had 6 barracks, which could house up to 300 prisoners. This is the Tuna Canyon Mess Hall. Detainee cooks were allowed to prepare meals. Tuna Canyon had an office building, an infirmary, and a recreation building. The recreation building had a library, and it was used for Buddhist and Christian religious services and to show movies. Activities for detainees included playing horseshoes and baseball. In the photograph on the left, notice the guard tower near the fence and the watchtower on the hill. Detainees maintained vegetable gardens. At one time they had a cornfield. There was a workshop where small items could be made. Even with such activities, confinement and separation from families were ever-present concerns. After Tuna Canyon, most San Diego Issei were transferred to Department of Justice camps at Fort Missoula, Montana, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. At these new detention camps, Japanese were given a hearing to determine their fate. However, hearings were not trials. There was no due process. There were no judges, only a board of 2 or 3 civilians. Detainees were not allowed to have lawyers. They did not know in advance what accusations or evidence would be presented. They were not allowed to do any cross-examination. I have examined the records for several hundred hearings. Some hearings were short, others lasted hours. Some hearing boards tried to make objective decisions, but many hearing boards uncritically accepted government allegations of detainee disloyalty, and detainees were presumed to be guilty unless they could prove their innocence. Kunitomo Maeda, the Coronado Island Issei leader, was sent to Tuna Canyon and Santa Fe. At Santa Fe, the hearing board recommended his permanent internment. He was sent to the Lordsburg, New Mexico internment camp and later back to Santa Fe. Maeda had a wife and 4 children in Japan and 2 adult sons in the U.S. He made the difficult decision to repatriate to Japan without his sons, who preferred to remain in America. While the Issei were imprisoned, the remaining San Diego County residents of Japanese ancestry were removed from their homes under Executive Order 9066. Most ended up at the Poston War Relocation Authority camp. Mr. Koide, the San Diego fisherman, had a wife and 5 children who were sent to Poston. He was detained at Tuna Canyon and Fort Missoula. After a hearing, he was interned at 2 other camps. He requested a rehearing and was paroled to Poston to be reunited with his family. In June 1945, the family resettled in Pasadena, where Mr. Koide began work as a gardener. Mr. Obayashi, the owner of the Sun Cafe, had a wife and 4 children who were sent to Poston. Like Mr. Koide, he was detained at Tuna Canyon and Fort Missoula. After a hearing, he was interned at 3 other camps. In early 1944, he was paroled to rejoin his family in Idaho. From Poston, they had resettled in Idaho to work on sugar beet farms. A year later, the Obayashi family was given permission to return to San Diego. Sachiko Umezawa, the Sunday school teacher, was sent to the San Pedro detention station on Terminal Island. After an appeal to the U.S. Attorney General by the Southern California Congregational Conference, she was released to return to her home in Chula Vista. Jitsu Yokota, the Shinto leader, was not so fortunate. She was also sent to San Pedro, and then to a special section of the Santa Anita Assembly Center along with 20 other Issei women. At that time, Santa Anita held West Coast Japanese Americans affected by Executive Order 9066. From Santa Anita, Yokota was transferred to a camp for women at Seagoville, and then to a camp for families at Crystal City. She passed away at Crystal City in March 1944. The separation of family members was one of the most devastating consequences of the incarceration of Issei. Emotional responses to separation were conveyed in many ways. This is a poem sent by a Fort Missoula detainee to his family in San Diego. Detainee family members pleaded with high government officials for help. The most poignant letters were written by young children. Here are excerpts from 2 letters on behalf of detainees who were not from San Diego County. The letters are being read by Nancy Hayata, a board member of the Tuna Canyon Detention Station Coalition.
Last week a letter came from my father saying that he would not be able to come home to us anymore. My mother is about to have a baby. I am 8 years old. During that time, I will have to take care of the other children, and it would be very hard for me. So we would like our father to come back, please. My father hasn't done anything bad. We know that, so we wonder why he doesn't come home. Since my father has been gone, we have been very sad. For our sake, will you please let our father come home right away? When is my father going to be released? Many people who have gone into camp the same time as him have come back, but why hasn't he? My mother worries so much about my father, so she can't sleep. She might get sick, so please try to release him. I am only 12. Will you please answer this letter, for I will be waiting.
I want to conclude by pointing out that the arrest and incarceration of Japanese, German, and Italian non-citizens at the beginning of World War II was legal, although this power was greatly abused by the government. The legal basis was the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which was recodified in 1918. This slide shows part of this law. This law is triggered by a presidential proclamation following a declaration of war or an actual, attempted, or threatened predatory incursion by a hostile nation or government. Note that an actual attack on the United States is not necessary. All that is required is what a president decides is an external threat. This gives presidents immense power, which can be used in the future against any non-citizen groups in the U.S. they see as threats to national security.
Back home in San Diego, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there were a lot, as you heard, of very unhappy children and Issei wives whose husbands had been taken away. 245 families through March of 1942. And then on April 1st of 1942, the poster that you see on the left-hand side here, the instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, were put up on telephone poles and by the banks and post offices, grocery stores, and places where Japanese and Japanese Americans were known to go or to do business, telling them within 1 week on April the 8th, they had to show up at the San Diego train station with one suitcase and be ready to leave. Now, they were not told where they were going, what the weather would be, how long they'd be gone, what temperatures to expect. It was just be there. Now, mind you, this notice was just directed to the people who lived in the southern part of San Diego County. The dividing line was the San Dieguito River up near the Del Mar racetrack. So if you lived south of there, you had to go on April 8th. If you lived north on there, you were deemed not to be so much of a threat to national security because you lived farther away from the military bases and the aircraft manufacturing plants that were down in the southern area. So those people had the ability to wait a little bit longer, perhaps make a little more plans, and they didn't go until about August of 1942. But the people in San Diego, they had to show up at the train station. It took a long time. They had to have paper tags put around their necks with a number on it that matched the number that was put on their suitcases. They waited all day. Now, mind you, this is children. This is non-English speaking women, the mothers of those children. These are Nikkei teenagers and young adults. They are all waiting for something to happen, and that's something that they don't necessarily know what that is going to be. So they go on the trains, and when they finally are done with their travels, they are ended up at the Santa Anita Assembly Center. This was a place north of Los Angeles that was formerly known as the Santa Anita Racetrack. New housing had been built in the center of the oval of the racetrack, but that couldn't house all the people who were brought there. And so some of them had to live in the vacated horse stalls from the racetrack. And let me tell you, as a former horseback rider, you never forget the stench of a horse once it has inhabited a stall. So these poor people had to live there from April of 1942 until when they were finally let know that they would be going on to their next destination, which is when they would be resettled at the Poston camp out near the Colorado River. This is a view of what the Poston camp looked like, and these black tar paper covered wooden barracks were built for the express purpose of holding people in a very hot, very dry environment. That's why they're covered with the black tar paper. There was no air conditioning. The black tar paper and a device that was called a double roof. There were two roofs put on you can see them in the very lowest in the left-hand corner of the barracks. Double roofs were supposed to somehow deflect the sunshine that was shining on these barracks, trying to keep the heat down. And of course, it was not very successful. A lot of people got very sick. Now, this is what is known as Poston Camp 3. That is the place where the southern San Diego County Japanese Americans were sent. Poston's camps 1 and 2 were about a mile away, and they were occupied first. So Camp 3 was the last of the ones to be occupied. It just wasn't ready for them at the time that the government was ready for the people to leave. Although there was housing, there was a lot that was missing from here. There were no schools. There were no recreation activities. In the center of the rows of barracks, you can see there's some small housing. It's not housing. These are the latrines, and these are the shower facilities, and these are the laundry facilities for the people that live within that grouping of barracks. So this is how people lived at Poston, but this same format was adopted by the other War Relocation Authority camps across the country. There was no reason to make it any different. They just were designed to house people for an indefinite period of time. Here is the map of the United States showing the 10 major relocation centers, as they called them. They were all in the Midwest, extending out to sort of the California border with Nevada or Arizona. That is, people were not allowed to live on the coast from the Canadian border all the way down to the Mexican border. So each of these camps, regardless of the terrain, the topography, the weather conditions, was built in much the same way as you see at the Poston camp. By the end of 1944, the Supreme Court failed to accept for review the law that had allowed the incarceration of the Japanese. And so plans were underway to return people to their points of origin. And so by early 1945, a special team of scouts was sent out from the Poston camp back to San Diego to see what the conditions were. Reverend Kikuchi from one of the Christian churches, Henry Koide, and Yutaka Fujii were sent to go explore. Now you can imagine, this is February. The war with Japan is still going strong. The bombs have not been dropped yet. And these poor men were sent back to scout out housing, possible jobs, to get an idea of what the safety of people would be if they were allowed to come back. And so people were allowed to come back, and a specially chartered train on September 12th, 1945, brought back the San Diego people from the Poston camp. Now, the image you see here is a young woman named Midori Kobakoga, and she is sitting on a Jeep outside of one of the housing projects that was built in San Diego during World War II. Now, mind you, during World War II, San Diego changed a lot while the Japanese Americans were gone. The population of the city rose from 200,000 to 416,000 because of the military and because of the aircraft manufacturing. A lot more people fighting for about the same amount of housing. This project was part of a government program that allowed housing for workers in the aircraft company, military members, and Americans whose family members had fought for the United States in the war. And that was the key to many Japanese Americans becoming residents at frontier housing near Point Loma. Their sons, their husbands, their family members had fought in the 442nd or the MIS, and so they were legitimately able to get housing at this frontier homes. The only problem was it was mostly white people who were very unhappy to have Japanese and Japanese Americans in their midst. And there was a difficult time of it. Eventually that kind of got solved, and there were many Japanese families that moved in there, and many of our young Nisei went to Point Loma and graduated from Point Loma High School because they were living at frontier housing. The community did not come back in a very good manner. The Japanese business district in the Gaslamp Quarter along Fifth Avenue never revived. Housing patterns were changed because of the level of discrimination and segregation in San Diego. One of our JAHSSD members tried to move into the Claremont community after the war, and he and his family were redirected to someplace in the South Bay because they didn't allow people of Japanese descent in Claremont at that time. Fishing boats had been confiscated during World War II, and when the fishermen went back to them, they found they were virtually useless. They had been all but destroyed. So the fishing business owned by Japanese businesses and individuals never recovered after the war, although isolated captains and workers were employed by the large corporations that took over the industry. The communities in Japan started to reach out to become friendly with the people of the United States once again. On the right, you can see a large stone lantern that was given by the people of Yokohama, Japan, as a friendship gift to encourage the development of a relationship between San Diego. The problem was that there was no longer any kind of a central business district or any central place where Japanese lived or worked. And so where do you put such a wonderful gift? It ended up being put at the San Diego Zoo because they agreed to accept it there. So the young woman on the left, who you may see, is someone you may know. It is Mildred Yamashita Kawasaki. The young woman on the right is Kei Takasugi, and they were part of that welcoming and thank you committee. On the left-hand side, under the roof shading it, is a large friendship bell, which was also sent by Japan in order to try to re-cement a relationship. Today, that bell is still there on Shelter Island, just outside the San Diego airport, but it looks a lot different because over the years, there have been many other reminders of the Japanese and United States relationship and the friendship of the peoples. But that is another example of something that was sent immediately after the war. Organizations started to get either rechartered or new ones were formed. In 1946, the JACL was rechartered in San Diego, and also some of the sporting clubs like the Kendo and the Judo clubs started offering activities again. Also, the Ikebana schools opened up again. But there wasn't a whole lot of and here, showing on the picture, by the way, of course, is the Veterans of Foreign Wars post 4851, which was formed in 1967. So there were 87 men who had fought in either World War II or Korea who were founders of this organization. And what they did to help with sort of the bringing together of the Japanese American community were two things. Number one was to have an event, which continues to this day, which is a memorial service for Memorial Day in the old Japanese cemetery at Mount Hope Cemetery in San Diego. The other thing they did, many of you remember bingo at the Buddhist temple, and this was a fundraiser, but it was also very much a friendraiser and was able to continue from its founding until COVID hit us in 2019. And we're hoping that we'll come back at some day. So the post-war community was getting together only for specific events, but there wasn't a lot of discussion going on about what had happened during the war, about what was going to happen with the artifacts that people may have brought back with them. And it wasn't until the Smithsonian Institution and the Japanese American National Museum, which was founded in 1985 in Los Angeles, started to approach groups of people who'd been in the camps to share their stories, to make available things that they had brought back. And so those were some of the things that moved forward in this early pre-war period, or post-war period. Also, by the 1980s, two different groups were working in parallel manners and cooperating manners in a campaign to have the U.S. government give an apology and redress for the losses that Issei and Nikkei suffered when they were moved from their homes and incarcerated. So two of these organizations were the national and local chapters of the JACL and the NCRR, or National Coalition for Redress and Reparation. They worked independently and cooperatively to host a series of events to encourage community members to get involved with the redress movement. And there were a number of meetings that were held where members of the community offered testimony to leaders in the government to describe what had happened to them. The picture in the upper left, it shows some San Diegans who went up to Los Angeles to testify in 1981 commission hearings. The picture on the lower right, a little bit of an error in the label there. These are people from around the country, Issei, who had been able to travel to Washington, D.C. In 1990 when the first reparation checks were given out. So they were given their presidential letters and their checks. By 1998, over 82,000 apologies and reparations checks had been distributed. So here's a woman that was very important in the Japanese American community. Her name is Clara Breed, and she was the children's librarian at the public library downtown at the time when the young Nisei children, before the war, were walking past the library in order to go to their schools in San Diego. And they would go in and chat with her. and became very friendly as the children's librarian. That was part of her job. Well, when they were taken away to the relocation camps, and she went down to the train station, handed out self-addressed stamped postcards, and asked people to write to her and to let her know what their stories were, what was happening. She wanted them to keep in touch. Much later, a woman, a writer named Joanne Oppenheim, wrote a book titled Dear Miss Breed, and summarized some of those letters and had remembrances of the people who were part of the group of teens that corresponded with Miss Breed. And in the second photograph, you see Louise Ogawa, who was one of those correspondents, with a retired Miss Breed. This is in 1991, when the San Diego group of Japanese Americans hosted a Poston reunion here, and Clara Breed was the honored guest. After the event, she said, "You have such a wonderful number of materials and people who are knowledgeable about the situation." She was aware of the fact that local college professor Don Estes, and then later his son joined him, Matthew Estes, were writing scholarly articles about Japanese American history, and they were published in things like the Journal of San Diego History, a scholarly publication of the San Diego History Center. So the history was being documented, but Clara Breed, the librarian, saw a need for it to be promoted and used as a way to explain to people what had happened. So she said, "Why don't you form a historical society?" And that is exactly what happened in 1992. And shown here are Don Estes on the left and one of our founding members, Ben Sagawa, on the right. And 1992, first newsletters went out. By 1996, we were hosting an exhibition about the wartime years at the San Diego History Center. And so we really made progress to be sure that the knowledge got out there about what had happened during World War II, so that events like this might not happen again. Thank you for your attention. I think Kay is now going to handle any chat questions that you may have from the audience.
Thank you so much, Linda and Russ. I'm trying to still sort of absorb all of that you've shared. And before I react, I did notice we had at least one question in the chat, and that is from Jan in Washington. Thank you, Jan, for putting that one in. And it's directed to Linda. If Linda has any knowledge of any of the previous buildings that you shared in part one of your slideshow, like in
Yes.
Vista, or are any buildings surviving?
Very few. Very few, because as you know, after the war, agriculture boomed and then housing boomed. And so these little old buildings, there wasn't much to make them, want to be saved.
Okay, unfortunate. And
yes.
If you have your chat open, Nancy Shimamoto, hi Nancy, has reminded us that this annual interfaith service at Mount Hope continues every year, and
yes.
the various churches and organizations participate. And please, it's always on Memorial Day. Please come out in the morning. It's usually like at 9:30 or 10 a.m. and there's plenty of information out. I'm happy to report that the Historical Society is having the flag pole repaired. That has been the problem. That we've not been able to change out the American flag that flies. And it's so weather beaten, it's very unattractive, but that has been the problem. So it requires a city permit. This is more than you ever wanted to know. It's not easy. And maybe that's why it hadn't been changed out before. I don't have to read these questions because people are in the house, so to speak, but one from Carolyn Suida. Hi, my sister. She's asking Russ, what type of work did you do for the Ide project, if you don't mind sharing?
Okay, I'm the project is headed by Duncan Williams, and he's the most visible person. But what Duncan has done, in addition to getting grants, in addition to all of the work he's done, is he's actually assembled a very large team of people. Some of them are working directly with him at his university, and other people are researchers that he's reached out to in the country who have done work collecting names for various camps and in other areas. And I just happen to be one of those people. Uh, I, because of my work with Tuna Canyon, I know a lot about the people who I discussed in my presentation, the Issei, who were arrested as enemy aliens at the beginning of the war. And my specific help with Duncan is to ferret out the names of those people who are not on lists, uh, like the WRA camp people are on lists. Their names are scattered throughout the National Archives. And so my contribution is to go to the archives and look for these names.
Oh my goodness, thank you. I've shared with many people that in the 80s, we used to say over 110,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed. But then by the 90s, we knew it was upwards of 120. And most recently with the E-Day project, it's up to at least 125,000 plus. And with your research, we have to thank you for digging up the information that would, be buried and being part of this team.
I'm interrupting because I see that Jan Awashta just asked a question about whether there's anything left at Tuna Canyon, and I know Russ would love to talk about that.
No, the buildings are all gone. The only thing that remains on the site are the trees, the oak trees that were there a long time ago that witnessed the events that happened. But everything else is gone from the site.
Russ, is there a memorial signage, plaque, or anything there?
Okay, there's a long story behind this. The site has been designated as a historical cultural monument by the city of Los Angeles. So we're attempting to put a plaque or a sign up on the site. And we also have plans to put up a memorial. The problem we're having, though, is that we don't have title to the land. The land is actually owned by a company that wants to sell it to a developer to put up over 300 houses. This is vacant land. And so there's been a fight mainly led by the people in the community to stop the housing project.
Yeah.
And we're sort of on the sidelines waiting to see what happens before we can do anything with either a sign or a memorial.
I think that people may have to leave because of the time, but I wanted Sam to make a couple of announcements before people drop off.
Yeah, thank you. Just one thing, as you leave Zoom, you'll see our survey about our programs, and it really does help us if you can take just a couple minutes and answer those very, very short questions about your experience today. And then additionally, we will be making this recording available. So if you do have to leave and you miss all the rest of the questions, you will have a chance to check it out. We'll send the link when it's ready to everybody who registered. So if you have friends who couldn't make it today, they'll be able to see it if they registered. And after that, we'll also share it with our mailing list at large as well. So it will be available. If you do have to head out, we so appreciate you being here today, but you'll be able to check it out later and share it with family and friends as well.
Thank you, Sam. Okay. Larry, your hand is up. Do you have a question?
Can you hear me? Not
Yes.
so much a question, but just thank you so much. Learned so much, especially with the detail of all the family stories that I've heard all my life. I'm the youngest son of Moto and Florence. And thank you, Russell, especially for mentioning my grandfather Asakawa and my grandmother Umezawa. And I don't know if you've ever heard this quick story, but my grandmother, after she was arrested coming back from the border, and she was sent to Terminal Island, all of the Issei wives that she was with were in a panic and crying. And the strong, wonderful woman that she was, she organized them and told them to stop crying. It's not going to help anybody. Let's make a list of everybody's here, and we'll figure out how to get notice out to the husbands and the community. And she was a really wonderful, strong woman, woman of faith, and because she was across the border, I believe, teaching Sunday school or something like that.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so that was one of my favorite stories from my grandmother at the time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I did not know that women were picked up, because all I'd heard about for decades is men, Issei men were taken. And so for Sachiko Umezawa to be
Umezawa, yes.
incarcerated, and
Yes.
did she go to Segoville, or was that the other woman?
No, the other woman went to Segoville.
Okay.
But
And then
Mrs.
so
Umezawa was released. Yes.
now, okay, that question would be for me, sorry, is I think you reported that she was released to San Diego, to Chula Vista again. Was she allowed to
Yes.
stay in Chula Vista during the war?
She was released before, I'll have to check the dates, but she was
Oh.
released before the mass incarceration.
She
So
was.
she was essentially allowed to go back home. And I don't know what happened to her afterward. Maybe other people know. I'm guessing that she was probably then part of the removal of people from San Diego.
I
I
see.
think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is more of a personal question to you, Linda. What has sustained you for 26 years? For any person to volunteer for one group for that long, what do you think it is that's kept you involved with the Japanese American Historical Society?
I think it's a combination of two things. I have met hundreds of wonderful people who have been willing to share their stories and just to talk to me about what happened. And then the other thing is that I can't do anything personally about what happened before I was born, but what I can do is put forth the efforts now to help other people know what's going on. So those are the two things that have kept me around. Thank you for asking.
That's terrific. Russ, there are so many different kinds of camps. It gets to be mind-boggling. Do you know, like, a rundown of the different kinds of camps and who they were for?
The story for WRA is pretty straightforward because we know about the so-called assembly centers and we know about the 10 main concentration camps. The story about the DOJ camps is more difficult, partly because records were not kept. And in fact, there are probably well over 100 sites at which people were incarcerated by the Department of Justice, people were arrested by the FBI and they were incarcerated by the Department of Justice and or the Army. Now, mind you, some of these sites are very tiny, and they just tell people, a few people for a little bit of time. I'm still running into names of places that I had never heard about before. But I think we're getting very close to finding out all of the places where people were held. So the San Diego City County Jail, incidentally, does qualify, in my mind, as an incarceration site, because what happened at the beginning of the war was so many people in Southern California were arrested that the Department of Justice didn't have room for them. So they executed contracts with various county jails to hold people for 2 weeks until facilities were made available or they could move people out of the area. And so the San Diego County Jail would have had a contract with the Department of Justice to be a temporary detention site from about December 7th until about the 16th. And this was true probably for all the other county jails in Southern California. So when you begin to count all of these county jails, and then also places throughout the country, because remember, people are getting arrested all across the US, not just on the West Coast, then the number of sites becomes very large very quickly. And we're also talking about sites in Hawaii and Alaska, Puerto Rico. People were held in the Canal Zone. So the number is very large and very distressing, actually.
Yes, definitely. That the word distressing, I did want to just point out the poem that you shared in your presentation. Pretty heartbreaking, the San Diego person who wrote the poem, and then the letters from young girls to the government pleading for their return. I think that one of the things that we always need to remember is the trauma, the pain caused by all the different events that you and Linda have shared, the human story, the element of loss, not just physical, but also, you know, time, opportunity, freedom, family, relationships. And then also the fear that the government created with not knowing where they had whisked off their Issei fathers and leaders.